So U.S. foreign policy in 3 key regions, what is to be done? Perhaps the hottest spot on the planet is the Korean Peninsula, but the conflicts in the greater Middle East and on the Russian border itself in the Ukraine, where Russia and U.S. governments are competing for influence, could easily turn into major conflicts between the 2 powers. This session will provide information about what is happening in all 3 regions and give us an opportunity to think about what we should do to avoid more war and to help bring about peaceful and just solutions. Our panelists, as I said, I think you're pretty familiar with them. The first one is Phyllis Bennis, or the first person I'm going to speak about is Phyllis Bennis. She directs the new international project at the Institute for Policy Studies. She is also a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. She is a longtime writer, and here are 2 books that we have in the tabling area that you can buy, and obviously Phyllis here, so you can get her to sign them. Maybe you weren't planning to do that, but that's too bad because you're here. She's a longtime writer, analyst, and activist in the Middle East and UN. In 2001, she helped found and remains on the advisory board of the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation. She writes and speaks widely across the U.S. and around the world and is part of the global peace movement. She continues to serve as informal advisor to several top UN officials in the Middle East and UN democratization issues. She is also a member of the Veterans for Peace Advisory Board, which I can't believe is not on this. That is a big mistake. I'm not sure if it was a number of people, but you were sponsored life membership last night in your absence.
I know.
So I want to thank Phyllis is a life member of Veterans for Peace. So that could even happen in your absence. Imagine what would have happened if you had been there. We have Colonel Ann Wright, and I'm not going to go through a whole lot of, because everybody knows Ann. And the biggest thing is just that she's just awesome. So that's the biggest thing to say.
Absolutely.
Yes. And yes, and she got the Gandhi. Okay. No. What was the award you got from the U.S. Peace last night? Yes, the Peace Memorial, which we received too. Yes, the Gandhi Award is next. Yes.
And the Nobel Prize.
And we have Will here, who is a board member of Veterans for Peace, a post-Cold War Iraq veteran. And you know what? I do not have your bio in front of me, and I'm like totally embarrassed. I know.
I'll do it. Yeah, I'll do this one. Yeah, Will Griffin is one of our great new members to VFP, only in what, 2 years, 2.5 years, 3 years, okay? And in that time, he's been on numerous international delegations with us to South Korea, to Jeju Island, to Okinawa, and back to Okinawa. And then he's just completed another trip to South Korea with the U.S. delegation to oppose the THAAD missiles. He also is one of the great media people that we have, with having created what's called the Peace Report, where you can see all sorts of videos of things that are going on all over the world. He was at Standing Rock numerous times, and we are really thrilled to have him as a part of Veterans for Peace.
So I'm just going to get out of the way and let you 3 go ahead with, and then we'll have a question and answer session, and then we'll go into March.
I was just going to say I'm just thrilled to have Will here as part of the younger generation, because that's such a challenge, and it's so important. Thank you, Michael, for all that you do for Veterans for Peace and beyond. And thank you all for being here early this morning. I know a lot of people were out late marching around. That's excellent. And I want to thank you all for the lifetime membership last night. I was so sorry I wasn't there. I have a good excuse, I think. I was at the event across town honoring Rasmia Oda, our great Palestinian heroine, who, of course, I think most of you know, after 25 years in this country, was suddenly charged with felony lying on her immigration status application years before, and suddenly was convicted, facing 10 years in prison at the age of 70 for a ridiculous charge that really had nothing to do with immigration and everything to do with Palestinian rights. So this was really an attack on Palestine and Palestinians. And there were 1,000 people gathered last night from across Chicago. It was an amazing moment to honor Rasmia and to say goodbye. But in the meantime, we have a lot of work to do. The news overnight, the news from Charlottesville. I wrote on my notes Charlotte, thinking I would remember to say Charlottesville. From a state that perhaps has the highest concentration within it of neo-Nazis and fascists and white supremacists of various sorts, and police who stood back and let them gather and come in and beat up and use a car as a weapon in an act of domestic terrorism to kill one of the anti-fascist organizers and injure at least 19 others, some of them critically, others very seriously. This is a huge example for anyone who had forgotten that the policies of this country brought to an entirely new level, although not new in its essence, the link between war and racism is fundamental in this country. For many years, there were organizations who defined our work as building movements against war and racism. And what we're seeing right now with the incredibly dangerous posturing from the White House about the possibilities of a nuclear attack, direct threats of using nuclear weapons in violation of not only international law, US law, logic, but any sense of humanity, any sense of morality, that just a casual reference, yeah, well, this will be the most fury they've ever seen. You know, it's as if nuclear weapons were just one more caliber of pistols that are lined up on the shelf and you pick which one you want. It's a frightening moment. It's a frightening moment when the president of this country refuses to acknowledge responsibility for militarized, overtly, openly, braggingly violent white supremacists who came in order to beat up people of color and anti-fascists and to kill them. When he will only say, well, we condemn all the violence on all sides. It's all bad. It's all bad. It's a dangerous, dangerous moment. It's not new that we have wars that are spiraling potentially out of control, that are moving around the world so fast that you get whipsawed just trying to keep up with them. That's not new. What is new, like what's new in the rise of racist and white supremacist and anti-Semitic and Islamophobic and misogynistic organizations, like those that we were seeing in Charlottesville last night and yesterday, that's not new. What is new is their sense, their accurate reading, their accurate understanding that they now have a presidential grant of immunity. That it's okay to do all that because the president has your back. That's what's new. That's what's new. And that is what we have to be looking at in this very dangerous moment. When we have a president who won't walk back from these direct threats, what does it mean that Trump has threatened to use nuclear weapons, to use them against Korea, if the Korean president, who has his own issues with a lot of things, well, having and wanting nuclear capacity for one thing, but also making idle threats, threatening Guam, really, but having a president who will say, I'm going to use those weapons if he uses words I don't like. He somehow missed the memo in 3rd grade about sticks and stones. You know, you can say whatever you want, but you don't use force. So he's saying, if he uses words I don't like, I will use those weapons at whatever cost, And finally, I'm not going to try and talk a lot about North Korea. I don't know very much about North Korea. Thankfully, we have people here who do. and I will leave it to them. But I just want to say one thing about the broader context in which the Korea crisis takes place. The nuclear crisis that's focused right now on Korea takes shape, takes place, takes its form in the context of a global pretense in this country. The view, the claim that we can demand and expect to have global non-proliferation without global disarmament. So what does that mean? It means that as long as the officially recognized nuclear powers, led by the United States, but also, of course, including Russia, China, France, and the UK, as long as they refuse to abide by their obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which under Article 6 says very clearly they have to move towards, quote, full and complete nuclear disarmament, as long as they simply laugh when you suggest that, why do they believe that everybody else is going to be fine with saying, oh, no, we won't have a nuclear weapon because we agreed not to if those guys agreed to give up theirs? Why would they? When they look at the model, not of South Africa, which was the exception, of the country who gave up a nuclear capacity voluntarily, that's not the model. They're looking at the model of Libya, where Libya was coerced into giving up a potentially viable, it wasn't yet, but it had the potential to become rather rapidly viable nuclear weapons program in exchange for an end to sanctions and the beginning of trade with the Western world. What did they get for it? They got, among other things, the invasion and overthrow of the regime change on steroids, with the leader of that country not only forced out of office, but captured, tortured, and murdered. That's the model that the leader of North Korea is no doubt looking at. So I think we have to be very conscious about the need to look back at history and to keep those frameworks in mind. Now that's all before we get to the rest of the wars that are going on while the world's attention is focused on North Korea. The world is at war. The continuing long war, the permanent war, the war against terror, whatever term we want to use, that war is expanding and escalating as we speak, even while so much attention is appropriately being focused on North Korea. So the US has now been at war with terrorism for 16 years, and terrorism is doing just fine. Terrorism is thriving. The people, where those wars are being fought, not so much. So when we look at Afghanistan, the longest of the particular wars against terror that we can look at, what do we see? We see an escalation every year since 2009 in the number of civilian casualties. The last 2 years, every year we've seen a spike in the number of women and children among those casualties. And what are we hearing? Well, we need to do something different. John McCain to the rescue. He's had it with not having a strategy. So he's going to have a strategy. What's his strategy? Well, first of all, we're going to have an anti-terrorism, a counter-terrorism war. Oh, that's a novel idea. Nobody ever thought of that one before. And we're going to send thousands of more troops to Afghanistan. Oh, that's a really good idea. It did really well the last time. You know, it's insane. This is what passes for new and different strategy. Now, he's right. There is no viable strategy. But the idea of repeating the last 4 strategies that have failed so nicely is probably not the most creative idea one might think about. So when we look at that, what are the alternatives that are being proposed? What are the alternative strategies being considered in the White House? My personal favorite is that of Eric Prince, the brother of the current Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos, a great credential, but more to the point, the founder of Blackwater, as you all know. You all know more than most about what Blackwater represents. Their proposal that they're shopping around, op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, very positive response on the Hill and in the White House, oh yes, we're considering this, is to say enough with US troops out. And we're like, yeah, really? US troops out? Yeah, US troops out, mercenaries in. It'll be cheaper. It'll be $10 billion instead of $40 billion. We'll send 5,000 and we will wipe out that Taliban. Oh, really? At what cost to civilians? And in fact, when you read John McCain's proposal, what's fascinating about it is it's very overt, it's very open. There's no claim here that this is going to make the people of Afghanistan safer. This is going to protect Afghan children and women. This is going to bring democracy. This is going to bring stability. Not even that. It's one line. The purpose of this strategy is to make sure that Afghanistan is never again used as a staging ground for an attack on the United States. That's the only reason. It has nothing to do with Afghans. If they die to ostensibly protect us, well, that's the cost of doing business, not our problem. That's what we're dealing with. That's what we're dealing with. And then if you look further around the world, I mean, it's like I don't know what to call it, as you try and keep up with what's happening in Yemen, what's happening here and there, and a new war pops up, new threats against, really now they're threatening military strikes against Venezuela. I mean, this one I actually don't think was a serious threat, but nonetheless, you can't afford to take anything off the table, as they say, when we look at where we have to be fighting against new wars. Palestine remains a huge crisis that we're hearing almost nothing about. The event last night with Rasmia was so extraordinary, partly because everybody who spoke, led by the great Angela Davis, spoke about Palestine, not only about Rasmia. Understanding that the attack on Rasmia was not just an attack on one person, heroic as she may be. This was an attack on work on Palestine. So we have a situation right now in Palestine where in the West Bank, the question of settlement expansion is rising faster than ever. In East Jerusalem, the new challenge around Israeli increasing control of the Al-Aqsa Mosque complex and all that has gone around that. And in Gaza, Gaza remains besieged. Electricity has been cut again. It's now averaging 2 hours a day for most people in Gaza, with the temperatures hovering around 110 every day. Water in Gaza is 93% undrinkable, and there's almost none of it available because the water treatment plant that was bombed twice in 2012 and 2014 by Israeli wars has never been rebuilt. People can't even go to the beach anymore and take their kids for a little relief because raw sewage is flowing into the beach, into the water, because the sewage treatment plant was also destroyed and never rebuilt. This is what has led even the U.S. State Department. Let me read you this quote. The U.S. State Department, this year's report on terrorism around the world, in the report on the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, they talk about what Palestinians are facing as the result of Israeli violations. They don't use that term, but they say this is what Palestinians face. They face, settler violence against Palestinians in the West Bank, the perception that the Israeli government was changing the status quo on the Haram el-Sharif Temple Mount, and IDF tactics that the Palestinians consider overly aggressive. Those are the words of the U.S. State Department. Despite that, they are doing everything they can to create this new legislation in the United States, mimicking the new legislation in Israel, to criminalize support for nonviolent protest in the form of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions campaigns to stop Israeli violations of international law and human rights. Right, so it's like if you take away all of the nonviolent options, what happens? People choose the options available to them. And then they say, why don't they choose nonviolence? Because you made it criminal. The new law that was endorsed by 47 members of the U.S. Senate, one of whom now has taken her name off, Kristen Gillibrand, and others are considering taking off their name because, hello, they admitted now they never read it. It was drafted by AIPAC, and so they just assumed it was okay. And when the ACLU came in and said, this is a massive violation of the First Amendment, this will never stand constitutional scrutiny, even with these courts, some of those members of Congress started to say, ooh, maybe we goofed. Maybe we better read it. Maybe we better go back, do just a little bit of due diligence. I think we're going to have more people following Gillibrand's model. It's hard to imagine her as the leader around this, but nonetheless, there you have it. It's drastic enough. It would criminalize support for boycotts, threatening a 20-year prison term in federal prison and a $1 million fine. Now, it turns out the language is so complicated, and it really doesn't involve BDS for a whole host of reasons. It involves other kinds of boycotts. But the facts don't matter. It's about intimidation. It's about convincing 18, 19-year-old students who are already nervous about how they get attacked on their campuses that if they support a BDS campaign to convince their college not to buy Caterpillar bulldozers every year when they need new snow removal equipment or something, that they could face 20 years in prison. Oh my God, I guess I'm not going to do that. If people believe that, it does its job. It doesn't matter whether you ever use that bill or not, whether you ever actually try and arrest somebody or not, doesn't matter. It's done its job if you can frighten people enough. So it's our job, particularly looking around the room, sorry, Will, that the older generations who have seen this before, we are the ones that have to remind people, we can get through this. We can get through this. We got through the Palmer raids. We got through the McCarran-Walter Act. We got through the McCarthy years. We got through the Nixon grand juries and COINTELPRO's attacks on the black community organizing. As movements, although a lot of people lost their lives, their jobs, their homes, as movements we survived because we are a surviving movement. This is the origins of our country. The great Howard Zinn taught us this, that we are the country grounded in racism, in genocide, and in slavery. This was the country that was created through the theft of the indigenous people's lands and made wealthy through the labor of enslaved people brought here in chains. But we are also the country that from the beginning had movements against genocide, against slavery, for human rights, to protect the environment, for women's rights, all of these movements. And that's what we have to keep in mind. It's why it's important when we see the difference between like Obama's speech in Cairo, which was an extraordinary speech, an extraordinary commitment that was never followed up, that was never implemented. But it was important to hear that as a model of what we can hold our leaders accountable to. Counter that with the current president who says, I was elected to do this. What he's saying today, I was elected to support these white supremacists. So who do you think you're talking to? Why should I condemn them? I was elected to support them. And whether he was elected without that 3 million votes or not, a lot of people did vote for him. And whether they voted for him because he said he would support those white supremacists or despite the fact that he said he would support those white supremacists, either way, they were voting for him. I think that we're looking at a very dangerous moment throughout the Middle East, throughout this place of the so-called global war on terror. Anne's going to talk a little bit about Yemen, where the humanitarian catastrophe is worse than ever. We're seeing this new partnership, a criminal gang, if you want, among the crown princes. The crown prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, and the crown prince in the United States, Jared Kushner. This little gang of brothers, these two have become great friends, great partners in crime, as far as I can tell. And they are orchestrating a lot of dangerous stuff in the region. I don't really have time to go through all of it, but I think what it comes down to is the building of a massive anti-Iran coalition. That's why we have to be very careful as we focus on this extraordinarily high, really precipice of potentially nuclear danger in North Korea. We cannot take our eyes off the Iran prize. I'm quite worried that while the eyes of the world are on North Korea for all the right reasons, and on the White House around North Korea for all the right reasons, that there's a very great danger that there could be a new US escalation, even a direct military strike on Iran. The trip Trump made, orchestrated by the Jared Mohammed team, to the Middle East when he went to Riyadh and made that speech, compare that speech with Obama's speech in Cairo, where he said, we don't care how you pray, we don't care how you treat women, we don't care about human rights, we're not worried about any of that. We are worried that we must be the strongest strategic allies. That means against Iran. That was the goal. That was the goal. We're going to be against Iran. So we're going to sell you $110 billion worth of new weapons this year and prepare to sell you $350 billion worth of new arms over the next 10 years. So you can work with us against Iran. That's what this attack on Qatar between the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Jordan and Turkey, Jordan and Egypt on one hand, and Qatar on the other hand, that's what it's about. It's not about Qatar. It's about Iran. Qatar is being targeted for the same reason that Yemen is being targeted, because they're easier targets. They're lower hanging fruit than Iran itself. And if you have 400,000 Yemenis down with cholera as a result, well, that's just the price that you pay. We're not paying it here, so what's your problem? America first. This is what America First means. It means America First to not feel the direct effect of war. America First to not pay the highest price for war. But we do pay a price. We do pay a price. For anyone who had the idea that when Trump talked about isolationism, that somehow that was going to include on the military side, yeah, well, you think again, because this is a way interventionist White House, as we're seeing. We're seeing this massive escalation. And we're seeing the wars come home despite the America First part. Because America First is about white people first, in the same way that making America great again means making America white again. That's what that's about. And when you talk about wars, that's where the link between war and racism comes back. If you want young soldiers, young drone operators, young pilots to be willing to drop bombs and send drones and kick down doors of a people they never met, in a country they probably can't even find on a map, who never attacked us, who never invaded us, you have to do something to make them willing to put aside their humanity. And you as veterans know better than anyone how the military does that. But the other side of it is it's not only the military that does that. It's our schools, it's the media, it's the Department of Education, it's the Pentagon, it's the White House, it's the White House, it's the White House right now. And what it looks like is Islamophobia. Islamophobia is not new to the Trump administration. Islamophobia has an old and sordid history in our country. But the reason that Islamophobia is so on the rise right now is because you need Islamophobia to convince people that these are people who are worthy of nothing but death. That if you kill them, it's fine. They're not us. They're not part of the America that's going to be great again. They're not part of America First. It's America First and Muslims last. So the Muslim ban is part of that, because you don't want them, in quotes, to be allowed into our country. So when we talk about, the 7 countries that, now it's 6, but originally it was 7 Muslim countries from where refugees, desperate people would not be allowed to come, these are already countries where the US is bombing 5 of the 7, has soldiers stationed in 1, and is sanctioning the last. These are not just arbitrarily selected Muslim-majority countries. There's plenty of Muslim-majority countries. These are the countries where the US is at war. And if we talk about the cost of that at home, the military budget, and I'm just going to do a quick moment on this because I want to end so we can have time for questions. The military budget, Trump asked for $54 billion more for the military budget this year. He got $97 billion more instead. And that means that 54 cents out of every federal dollar still goes to the military. That's the answer of why we don't have enough money for health care, why we don't have enough money for jobs, why we don't have enough money to keep our veterans housed and with decent medical care. That's where the money goes. It goes to the Pentagon. And if we look at just what this year's budget, this year's military budget, could have paid for instead, and that's not, remember, this is just the mainline budget of the Pentagon. It's not including veterans' health care, it's not including the nuclear weapons arsenal, and it doesn't even include the actual wars, because as you know, they have their own budget. But if you look at just the mainline budget that sort of keeps the lights on at the Pentagon, we could have paid for 6.5 million teachers for a year, 9.5 million infrastructure jobs, 59 million kids into Head Start. What makes us safer? That's the question that we have to answer. So in my last moment, I just want to say a couple things about our movement. As you all know from your work with Veterans for Peace, the veterans' peace organizations are among the strongest in the peace movement right now. But I got to say, that's a pretty low bar. Because the peace movement right now, the anti-war movement, is not very strong right now. We've got some real problems. And it's not because of people not caring about it, it's because there are so many crises that are so much closer to home that people are faced with losing their own homes. They're faced with police running amok on the streets. There's a link. Why were there tanks on the streets of Ferguson? It's because the Pentagon had to do something with these extra tanks when they brought them home from Afghanistan. That's the link between war and racism. Our job, I would say, sisters and brothers, our job right now is not so much to worry about rebuilding a strong, independent peace movement that's going to lead the broad progressive movement the way we did for periods of time in the early years of the Iraq War, for instance, but rather is to get the information that we have access to, that you all have as veterans, that the anti-war movement has through the National Priorities Project and others, to say, these are the costs of war in our communities, why we have military weapons in our communities, why in our police forces, why we have US police forces being trained by Israeli occupation soldiers. Jewish Voice for Peace is running a big campaign on that. There's campaigns like that that need to be expanded. And I would assert that our job in this period is to bring that information and get it into the hands in a way that's useful, not just, you guys should be looking at this website, but, or not even, you guys should be coming to our events, but us going to people where they are. Right now, that means in the streets, saying, what can we do to help? How can we make the links clearer? What will be useful for your base in understanding why money is such a problem in our local communities? We need to be bringing that to Black Lives Matter, to Standing Rock, to the immigrant rights movement. We have to look at the movements, the sanctuary cities movements, so important right now in protecting refugees, but also understanding that if we really want to protect refugees, we have to stop the wars that create refugees. That can't be separated out. That's a huge challenge. That's a huge challenge that we have. And saying it, everybody says, yeah, right, yay. But making it real is not so easy. Making it real is not so easy. When you go back to your communities, that's one of the jobs, I would say, of Veterans for Peace chapters. Go out to the groups that are working on sanctuary and talk about how do we expand the sanctuary movement. So it means providing sanctuary to people of color who are being threatened by police on their own streets. How do we link that kind of sanctuary with the sanctuary of people crossing borders because they are desperate? How do we link that with the question of refugees? And finally, on the question of our broad goals, when we talk about solidarity and internationalism, because this requires an international response. The threats in North Korea, the threats of nuclear war, the threats of the so-called global war on terror, which among other things is fomenting terrorism all around the world. These are global crises that demand global movements to challenge them. And when we look at what Dr. King has taught us, not only in the intersection of racism, poverty, and militarism as the three triplets of evil, that's our job to challenge, he said something else at that extraordinary speech just 50 years ago in Riverside Church, in his Beyond Vietnam speech, when he said, the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. But it doesn't bend by itself. It bends when we are out there bending it. That's what bends history towards justice. It doesn't happen by itself. And if we keep that in mind, and keep in mind what Howard Zinn taught us about the two nations in which we live, the nation that is grounded in genocide and slavery, and the nation that has always had movements against genocide and slavery, that's when we start to win. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Will Griffin. I was asked to be on this panel after the booklet was printed, but even, hearing, I looked at the booklet and I saw Phyllis Bennis and Wright on there. I said, ooh, wow. So I've been a little nervous about this.
We said that with her.
Yeah. So, in case anybody is wondering, I am half Korean. I did live in Korea as a child for 4 years, but that alone doesn't make me an expert in these things. I hear a lot of veterans, not in VFP, but veterans who've been to Korea and say, I lived there for 2 years, I know everything that's going on and all this. That doesn't make you an expert just living there. But in college I did study Chinese history and U.S. foreign policy in the Asia-Pacific region. And since graduating in 2014 and joining VFP, I've been to Korea 3 times. Last year I stayed in Korea for 3 months. And I just recently came back from a U.S. Solidarity Peace delegation where I was joined with Jill Stein from the Green Party, Medea Benjamin from Code Pink, and Reese Chenault from U.S. Labor Against the War, and myself representing Veterans for Peace. And the trip was organized by a coalition called Stop THAAD in Korea and Militarism in Asia and the Pacific. And we made these scarves, this blue scarf right here, which I have plenty to hand out if you want, and we also have pins to help show solidarity with our brothers and sisters in South Korea who are fighting this militarism in general. And it's the symbol down below is a blue butterfly, or maybe even like a blue ribbon, which is like, you know, the support our troops ribbon here, but over there, the blue one has a completely different meaning. It means they oppose the THAAD anti-missile system, which I'll be talking about. So our delegation was July 22nd to July 28th, and we met with all kinds of organizers in South Korea that are so dynamic and interconnected. South Korea's history in the past 70 years has been rapid transformation from a poor country to the 12th largest economy in the world, a heavily militarized country. They started off with a military dictatorship to recently impeaching a conservative right-wing president that was corrupt to having now a liberal Democrat. And that's one of the things we actually kind of warned them about, that, you know, Obama came into office and the peace movement died. And we wanted to let them know, hey, you know, this is what happened in our country. Keep making your stand there, because, you know, the South Korean, or the Korean Peninsula, and its military issues surrounding the region is a huge threat to not just the Koreans, but all of us. So we had 3 main goals. One was to remove the THAAD anti-missile system. So if you're not familiar with it, it's a so-called missile defense system, which we call a missile offense system. It stands for Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. Essentially, it's a missile that is designed to shoot down an incoming missile. Some people have called it, described it as shooting a bullet with another bullet. And we've spent billions of dollars on missile defense systems. We have them in Romania, Poland, Guam, Japan, South Korea, all over in the Baltic Seas and other oceans around the world. It's a global system that is destabilizing regions, just like it is in the Asia Pacific. And it's been proven, despite the tests, the Missile Defense Agency says that has a 100% success rate, which has kind of already been debunked because these tests have been set up to where they know where the missile is coming from, what altitude it's going to be at, what direction it might be coming from. But I mean, there are several arguments of why THAAD shouldn't be there. One is that, like I said, it stands for Terminal High Altitude. And North Korea is so close to South Korea, why would they even need to shoot a missile at such a high altitude? And that is only designed for incoming threats over 45 kilometers high. North Korea could easily just use a short-range missile, or even conventional artillery and weapons that they have that could completely destroy Seoul. So really, it cannot protect South Korea. Another thing against missile defense systems is missile decoys. So, I mean, North Korea or any country could shoot several warheads, several missiles, and only 1 or 2 of them might be the real warhead, but the THAAD system, or the radars that we have in missile defense systems, cannot detect which one's real. And it's so inexpensive to make missile decoys and so much more expensive to create the actual missile defense systems that we cannot outnumber them. And that's simply what other countries are investing in, North Korea, China, and other places, because, you know, we're spending billions of dollars here. They just need to make a couple missile decoys, and the system gets defeated. David Sanger from the New York Times wrote an article earlier this year that had a link to a Missile Defense Agency report that showed missile defense systems as a whole has a 56% failure rate, right? So we're still spending billions and billions of dollars. I was in Huntsville, Alabama earlier this year, which is the home of missile defense. And it's you can see the money that goes into the defense industry there, because General Atomics, General Dynamics, Lockheed, Northrop, Raytheon, they're all centered in Huntsville, where their main thing is missile defense there. And South Koreans don't want that. They don't want war. And this has been, we met with government officials. We met with the local villagers where the THAAD system is deployed. But we've also met with tons of organizing groups, from labor groups, the Green Party groups, the peace groups, mothers and women groups, student groups, all interconnected because their history has kind of joined them together to fight particular issues. The labor unions down there are really leading the way on peace issues and anti-war issues. Their skills are amazing. Their organizing skills are just phenomenal. They can get thousands of people out in the streets next week if they needed to, which I think is something that we could learn here in the U.S. So the first goal of our trip was to remove that. The second one was to end the annual war games that goes on the Korean Peninsula, which some have said are the largest military training exercises in the world, and very threatening to North Korea. We've had training policies called decapitation, and we had the Navy SEAL Team 6 training there earlier this year, and we've even done, or the U.S. has done, nuclear bomb dropping drills on the North Korean peninsula. And for some reason here in the U.S., that's not considered a provocation. But if North Korea, makes a threat towards us, we freak out. And the North Koreans have been living through this daily nuclear threat for decades. And the third goal was to just get our governments in the region to sit down and talk, engage in diplomacy. Hopefully, Trump and Kim Jong-un can have a hamburger together, right? Which is super important, and it has worked. And then going there, we learned a lot about the past year of organizing in the country, what many have called the Candlelight Uprising. Some of us participated in a candlelight vigil outside of the Trump Tower last night, right? Well, the reason we did the candlelights was because South Korea has been doing it on a daily basis for over a year, which led to the impeachment of their own president, which shows the power of the candlelight vigil. And it's still going on. We participated in some of them in the local villages. And they're looking at their new president, who was President Moon Jae-in, who was put in the power through the candlelight vigils. But, every promise that he has said, he has either refused to talk about or turned his word against. One thing was to remove the THAAD system. And you may have heard in the news that he did stop the THAAD system and asked for an environmental impact study, but that was completely false because the THAAD system is a system and it was already operating. The U.S. wanted additional launchers to be added, and he said no to the additional launchers, but the THAAD system was already up and running. So he wanted it to appear like he was standing up against U.S. policy and influence, but really he was still abiding by U.S. policy, which has been going on for decades again. And then all under the guise of this threat of North Korea. And, I've even heard at the conference here, this might throw up some alarms and you may disagree, but I think we should have a discussion about it, that North Korea is unpredictable. It's really crazy and does all these, it does some horrible things inside of its own country, but do we not kill innocent brown and black people here in the States and have the largest incarceration rates, and we've been at war for 16 years and we're spending all our resources on the military industrial complex, and we have a failing economy and infrastructure and education and healthcare, right? Who's crazy? And history has shown that North Korea is actually very predictable. They have frozen their nuclear programs in the past. In 1994, the framework agreement, during the six-party talks. So whenever the U.S. does sit down and actually talk to them, they're willing to freeze their nuclear weapons. But we have to get our government to sit down and actually talk to them. And these training exercises that happen every year, deployment of missile defense systems. So in South Korea, the U.S. has 83 military bases, right? 83, 30,000 troops, SM-3 missiles, PAC-3 missiles, now the THAAD missiles, constantly doing nuclear threats towards North Korea for decades. This is a provocation. And these are the types of things that need to end in order for North Korea to... And North Korea, by the way, voted to ban nuclear weapons in the nuclear UN nuclear vote.
Yeah.
I mean, a lot of people don't know that. They voted against it. They want to... They're trying to... They're trying to send messages to the world. Hey, we want to not spend our money on nuclear weapons. We want a peace treaty. But listen, the U.S., the largest military in the world, is just threatening us all the time. We can't stop making these things. And look at, they know what's going on in the Middle East with Libya, Syria, Iraq. We've taken down, regime change over and over. We've invaded countries, right? Well, why is North Korea still there? Well, maybe it's because they're building nuclear weapons and we don't want to invade them because they have nuclear weapons now, right? And they have a large military that's ready to go to war, and we know that it's going to be very devastating if we do that. And also, by the logic of U.S. foreign policy, we shouldn't be fighting against North Korea. We should be selling them weapons like we do Saudi Arabia or Israel. We shouldn't, though, yeah, for sure. Another point that I do want to make that I think is important is a lot of times when we talk about Korea or U.S. foreign policy in Korea, we only talk about Korea. We don't talk about the regional issues. And my argument is that we can't talk about Korea unless we talk about the region, especially China and Japan. And we have people here from Japan and Okinawa that completely understand this because it's their life. It's a regional issue. I don't know if you know, in 2011, Obama announced the pivot to Asia, where 60% of our naval forces will go to the Asia-Pacific region. If you go to the U.S. Pacific Command website, it states clearly that we have over 375,000 military and civilian personnel in the Asia-Pacific under U.S. Pacific Command. That's a large presence. 83 bases in South Korea, 122 bases in Japan, 50 bases in Guam, and all types of military equipment, thousands of aircraft carriers as well, warships, you name it. And for the region, it's I want to get through this real quick because it's super important. The huge military posture in the Asia-Pacific, I would argue, is not for North Korea. It's actually geared towards China, which is something I think we keep forgetting. But in order to have such a huge military presence in the Asia-Pacific, we need a boogeyman. We've always needed a boogeyman. And the boogeyman now in Asia is Kim Jong-un, DPRK, North Korea, and whatever happens inside of its own country. Which is crazy because how many countries has North Korea invaded since 1953? How many countries have they bombed, right? Can't compare. And also with the regional issues, the pivot, I'd say, is continued U.S. foreign policy and Western policy in Asia. There's something a lot of people that don't know called, it's called the Century of Humiliation of China. In 1839 to 1949, China regards this as like a century of national humiliation where Western powers, invaded China, took it over, and as they say, carved it up like a melon. Like we heard that with World War I in the Middle East, but that happened in China before. Like the British Empire was growing opium in India and selling it, forcing it on the Chinese people. Created the Opium Wars, created the Boxer Rebellion, which is Chinese movements to fight back against foreign invaders, sacking of the king's palace, so many different things that happened over the century of humiliation. But the whole point is that Western policy has always been about controlling China. And there's actually a quote from a US senator that I want to read. Actually, before I say that, we've heard about the US colonizing the Philippines. At the same time, Japan was colonizing Korea. And there was agreement between the US and Japan and said, hey, the US said, Japan, you can have Korea if you let us have the Philippines. But it wasn't necessarily just about colonizing these countries. It was about having access to the markets in China. Again, selling opium. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his grandfather was nicknamed the American King of Opium. So Roosevelt's family lineage were drug dealers, international drug dealers. She said, is that fake news? So in 1900, a US Senator, Albert Beveridge, has quoted, "The Philippines are ours forever, and just beyond the Philippines are China's illimitable markets. The power that rules the Pacific is the power that rules the world." It's always been about China's markets. It's always been about the huge population. It's always been about trade. It's always been about profit. And it is today. But the reason we don't talk about saying we need to go to war with China is because we still need those markets. The U.S. wants the cheap labor. They want the sweatshops. Everything we have in America is made in China. But if we call a direct threat towards China, that might end. But the U.S. and the Pentagon wants a way to try to contain China, control it, and that's why we're building tons of bases and building up our military posture over there. This is really highlighted in John Pilger's latest film, The Coming War on China. I highly recommend it. And if you do want to watch it for free online, you can check out my website, thepeacereport.com, that has links to all types of films, including John Pilger's film. The last thing I'm going to end with is I spoke with some academics in South Korea, and they brought us some really good points. And to sum it up, the threat isn't really North Korea. The real threat for all countries is climate change, right? And we have some of the largest militaries and economies in the Asia Pacific. China is the second largest economy. Japan is the third largest economy. The U.S. is in the region, the largest economy. And we have powerful militaries there. And we all have a common enemy, which is climate change. And we should be either trying to convert our military to start fighting climate change. I'd love to see troops deployed to climate zones instead of combat zones to actually do a good service for the people. But even if you take the money out of the military and actually create some type of infrastructure where we can start facing climate change, because this is such a vast problem and a significant problem. But also, there's a common fight among U.S. military, or U.S. as a whole, China as a whole, South Korea as a whole, because climate change is a serious issue for cities like Seoul, where there's at least 10 million people in the city and 25 million people in the greater region. And climate change and the rising tides can make Seoul go underwater very quickly. And a lot of people aren't understanding that, how devastating the impacts of climate change are going to be. So we could actually use this argument and try to and set it towards something like climate change and global warming, and also help de-escalate the tensions between our militaries in that region. So those are some things I think we should all definitely talk about. And also, last thing, there was a statement put together by the Okinawa and Japanese chapters that we're going to hopefully get Veterans for Peace as a whole to put out. It's a statement, an emergency appeal from Veterans for Peace to address these fire and fury threats and the North Korean threats against Guam, because this is a really serious issue. But we have this, and hopefully we'll get it out, get more copies printed out as soon as possible, because we can't fight this alone, and we all have to come together and actually, focus on Asia-Pacific issues. It's been so hard for me to get people to focus on things that are going on in Asia, but these threats are kind of helping people to focus on these issues now in a good way. And that's why I'm here on this panel with Phyllis Bennis and Wright. So thank you very much. And afterwards, I'll give you some scarves and pins if you want. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Will. That was an excellent presentation. The first one we've kind of heard from Will on this, and we are thrilled. And Phyllis, of course, Veterans for Peace thanks you for coming here again to tell us, a wide world view of what's happening. It's pretty discouraging, isn't it? Ooh, man. Oh. But one thing that may give you a little hope that maybe we're succeeding on something. Last night, before Larry Wilkerson started speaking, he and I were having a little conversation up there at the table, and I said, well, Larry, what are you hearing about our old military? How's it hanging in there? And he kind of went, oh, shit. But it was very interesting. He said, and he did mention this briefly at the banquet. He said the all-volunteer force is in trouble. Well, what he didn't expand on is how much trouble it is in. He said that the Air Force right now has 2,000 unfilled aircraft pilot vacancies, that it has 1,000 drone operator vacancies, that it is, that's right, and we should applaud that. I mean, that is what we're after. Part of this is trying to prevent young men and women from joining the military as one way to knock out one of the legs of militarism. If you don't have a big military, you can't do a whole lot of warmongering all over the world. He also said right now the U.S. Air Force is giving a signing bonus to get people to come in to be a pilot of $100,000 if you'll go into flight training. He said that last year, in order for the Army to meet its recruiting goals, they had to take 3,000 NCOs, non-commissioned officers, out of their basic duties and deploy them all over the country to beg, borrow, and steal people's kids. And that was the only way that the Army made its quota. They were something like 40,000 behind schedule as far as recruits. And they had to spend something like $10 million extra dollars in their massive recruiting budget in order to get their quota. So that means that we have some fertile ground out there to keep throwing these seeds out to communities to say, what are you joining for? Do you want to be part of this continuous war for 17 years, and does it look like it's going to end? No, it sure doesn't look like it's going to end. And parents around the country, I would hope, are saying, I don't really think I want my kids involved in that. So I think our counter-recruiting is really important now. And going back to the basic theme of what we have is this year's conference theme of, what's the exact title of it? Education, not militarization? Yeah. I think we really need to pull out all the stops, and we need to be looking on the websites of the U.S. military where they're talking about recruiting, and every now and then you'll find some articles like in Stars and Stripes or in military.com that will actually have some truthful articles about the difficulty of recruiting. We need to use those. We need to go after our own family members, our own, well, that's tough, maybe not that. Leave the family alone. We're in enough trouble probably with most of our family anyway, so don't bring this up at Thanksgiving dinner. But maybe your neighbors or, wherever you find the fertile ground, let's start talking about this, that young men and women aren't really joining up. And if these wars are so darn important for our national security, we need to force the issue. If it's good enough for the nation, it's good enough for everybody in the nation, and not just people of color and people of lower incomes. That indeed, if the United States is going to keep going at these wars, it has to be spread out over everyone. So let's use these ideas that Larry Wilkerson put out there, that indeed the military is in trouble. And even though the expenditures, as Phyllis noted, the expenditures for the U.S. military just keep going up, up, and up, and the potential, as we've seen after Gulf War I, when the privatization of the U.S. military started, and military functions were being signed over to our military industrial corporations, and things like Blackwater and DynCorp and all of these contractors started getting the multi-billion-dollar contracts, actually taking over part of military duties. That's why the increase is there. It's to go back into our military-industrial complex. So we've got a lot of material to work with, to expose what really is going on. And of the exposing of things that are going on, as Phyllis has talked about the Middle East and the global war on terror, and then Will has talked about Northeast Asia, I'd like to bring in another part of the world, and that's Europe. Europe and the former Eastern Bloc countries and Russia. Ray McGovern, Bill, where's Bill? And then Kathy Kelly and I were on a delegation 2 summers ago. Was it only last year? I mean, I'm confused on dates anyway. Was it 2 years ago in 2015? We went on over a 2-week trip into Russia, starting in Crimea. Starting in Moscow, then going down to Crimea, then going to Krasnograd, and then to St. Petersburg. And we wanted to find out what's going on. I mean, this was during the Obama administration, 2015. If you look at what's happened right now, all of this stuff about Russia, well, it didn't start with Donald Trump, for God's sakes. This stuff started back in the Obama administration, when we were all stunned about what the heck is going on here. I mean, the Obama administration's going after Putin and going after Russia, and I mean, certainly the annexation of Crimea after the U.S.-sponsored coup in the Ukraine. That's what the Obama administration started all this. So we went there to try to find out what was going on, and as it's to find out, are the Russians against us again? They were during the Cold War, or was it we were against them? Or how did that happen? Thinking back on it, how did all that happen? Well, we can't even remember 2 years ago how all of that started happening. But it was primarily through a U.S.-sponsored coup in Ukraine. That's when it all started. And then the intense vilification of Russia. That how many people were killed in World War II in Russia? 28 million? Yeah, 28 million. The highest casualty figure in all of World War II. A place that has a geographic area of an expanse huge. I mean, it's like 4 times as big as the United States, but how many people live there? We have 320 million. I think Russia has 180 million. Let's see, boy, they ought to have the biggest military in the world, shouldn't they? Yeah, well, the United States, just this increase that Phyllis talked about this year in the budget of the United States for the increase in our military budget is more than Russia spends in its total budget. The United States spends 10 times more in our military budget than Russia does. So we went there to talk to Russians. What do you want? What do you want out of us? And they said, well, what do you want out of us? I mean, here the Soviet Union has dissolved. There are 15 new countries formed out of the old Soviet Union. Russia has, we have elections, and arguably they're, let's see, are they as good as the United States, or is the United States as bad as theirs? Or, no, they have some elections. I mean, a lot of people get elected there that I wouldn't want, and same here. They said, you all wanted us to move out of that socialist model, that communist model, that hated communist model. You know, the old, what was it? Was it Reagan, the axis of evil? Yeah, the axis of evil. Or that was Bush. But what was the axis of who?
The evil empire.
Evil empire, oh yeah. Yeah, Reagan. Yeah, you called us the evil empire. Reagan called us the evil empire. You know, we were communists, we were socialists, we were, you know, all of that. And look at us now. We're not. Our cities look just like your cities. And it's true. How many of you all have been to Russia lately? A couple of you. Well, you ought to go. Just like you ought to go to China. I mean, it's not like these old communist countries are sitting there like they were 25 years ago. These places are every bit as cosmopolitan, every bit as metropolitan, and in many ways better off than the United States, with better infrastructure than we have, particularly if you're talking about China. But the Russians said, you know, listen, we've done everything you wanted us to do. We've privatized our economy. We sold off at your suggestions. We sold off our state enterprises. We privatized everything. I mean, it didn't work out too well for them, as it hasn't really worked out too well for us either. They said, what do you want from us? What do you want? Why are you guys vilifying us? Well, it's because your country annexed Crimea. And they said, well, how many people got killed in that? And how, well, first, was it by, did we actually invade, or was there a referendum? Well, yes, there was a referendum. The people of Crimea voted to go with the Soviet Union, or the Russia. Well, how, were people killed? Well, I think were there any people killed? I don't think so. Zero. Nobody got killed on that. So the question, why are we vilifying them? Well, that's kind of 2 years ago, and then all of a sudden the only thing we hear in the news is whether or not the Russians hacked into emails. That's what it's all about now, hacking into emails. And then there is this little thing about perhaps hacking into electoral systems, which I'm concerned about. I don't really want anybody messing, huh? Well, I don't know. I think there may be some arguments on that one, that indeed there are some states that are saying somebody hacked into it. Now, who it was, just like who hacked into the DNC emails. That's where Ray McGovern and the Veterans Intelligence Professionals for Sanity have been doing a heck of a lot of work, and they're surmising right now from all of the very detailed information that they've gotten from specialists who know how hacking happens, people that have formerly been with the National Security Agency, that it was a domestic hack, not an international hack. So there's a lot of stuff to this. There's a leak. Yeah, perhaps it's a leak. So this whole thing of the demonization of Russia, which has really gotten another hotspot, a potential disastrous military confrontation going. You look what the United States is requiring NATO to do. The largest number of NATO exercises now in Eastern Europe and in Scandinavia, where countries in Scandinavia that never have participated in NATO exercises before have now been strong-armed into doing that. I was in Brussels in June for the No to NATO conference, and then in Hamburg in July for the G20 conferences. And the amount of information that's being brought to us now by people that are living in those areas saying, you in the United States don't really realize what the militarization of our countries is the level of it. And particularly now in Eastern Europe. In Eastern Europe, where the United States has missile defense batteries, missile offense batteries, right on the Russian border in Poland and in Romania. These are so dangerous, these things that are happening there. And as Will mentioned, one of the military exercises at the DMZ in North Korea was titled Decapitation. Well, that kind of, that sends a signal to the North Korean regime, what we're after. Well, in the same manner, one of the military exercises, let's just call them war games. They're not exercises, they're war plans being practiced, was called Anaconda, encircling, gonna squeeze you to death. Well, the bottom line is it is a very tense and dangerous situation right now where any side could inadvertently, if not, well, I hope it would be inadvertent. I hope nothing happens, but I would hope it would be inadvertent, that nobody is going to purposely start any sort of a military confrontation there. But of course we have to keep our eyes on that. And then I'll just also mention back in the Middle East, and going back to Yemen, I mean, talk about one of the great catastrophes in our world that's going on right now. Right now, where the United States is backing Saudi Arabia. They were selling them $110 billion of weapons plus more to come. And the sole purpose of those weapons is to bomb the hell out of the poor people of Yemen. The poor people of Yemen, one of the most poverty-stricken countries of the world. I mean, the United States really goes after those down on their luck. We don't go after, we bluster against countries that could do harm to us, but the places that we really go after are the ones that can't defend themselves. And now the proxies are the Saudis. The Saudis bombing the hell out of people. The United States, of course, is not only selling weapons there, but we're doing drone strikes there. Last year we did 40 drone strikes, and this year we're already at 31. So we have another 6 months to go on that. No doubt we'll be hitting 60 to 70 drone strikes there. The whole issue of the health of the people of Yemen, the starvation that's going on there, the cholera, as Phyllis mentioned, where 400,000 people have cholera. I mean, if 400,000 people have cholera because of polluted water and sewage there, that number is just going to keep going up and up and up and up. Cholera is the fastest moving disease I think there is in the world. And yet the United States stands by and makes no effort at all to try to stop the brutal attack by the Saudis on Yemen. I know several people have been able or trying to get into Yemen, trying to get in there to be reporters. The Saudis are refusing to let international reporters into Yemen, refusing to. They're purposely putting an air cover over Yemen so that no aircraft except those aircraft that they authorize can come in. The international airport in Sana'a, the capital, has been closed for over a year. Only UN flights, 1 a week, is allowed in under a special air corridor. Reporters are refused entry in there. Humanitarians, unless they are specifically picked by the Saudis, they're the only ones in. It is a horrific condition that's going on in that country. And I hope that you will plead with your congressmen and women that the United States stop its brutal assistance to the Saudis on what they're doing to the Yemenis. Now, I know that there are a lot of people that have a lot of questions. We've got Phyllis here, we've got Will here, and we've got me here, and so why don't we stop, and whatever questions you have, we'd be glad to take. Thank you.
All right. First, I just want to say thank you so much. As we knew, we was going to get a lot of great information and an awesome panel, and please forgive me, Will, for not having. And thanks for saving me. Yes. Okay. So, questions, and we're going to do a few because we want to get started. Yes.
Yeah, Ann, I was just going to ask about the expulsion of the 750 people. What kind of impact is that? And I know Trump said, great, we don't have to pay that many people to be there. From your position,
Yeah, well, the expulsion of over 700 people from the U.S. Embassy in Moscow,
That's a good idea.
I'm shocked that it took the Russians that long to do that. I mean, after we expelled theirs during the last days of the Obama administration, usually it's one for one, you're out. But Putin gave the Trump administration some time to see how the Trump administration was going to have dealings with the Russian government and normalize relations. Yeah, well, and that has not gone very well, and so I think Putin just said, okay, that's it. After the U.S. sanctions on Russia again put on. The work of the embassy, of course, will be curtailed, although many of those 700 apparently are Russian citizens themselves that work for the embassy. I think the thing that we need to be more concerned about is the lack of filling of positions in the State Department itself by the Trump administration. That's where the real hurt is, I think, on U.S. foreign policy. Thank you.
Okay, what I'm gonna do is take like 3 questions and then they'll answer them. So I want to get a woman. I saw your hand, yeah, and then I'll come back around. Very, very, very short. We'd rather have questions.
And one of the collateral damage is hope. So in the talks that you have done, first of all of you have given me hope. But what I see is that we need to educate, as you said, others, because our population feels pretty hopeless, and a plug for peace in our time. I was so pleased that Dr. Wallace gave me something to do to spread that to our community, because we know that another casualty has been the free press. So share with people things they can do as we educate. Thank you.
This is also a quick comment too. Actually, the Russian trip was 2016 because it was the 75th anniversary of Barbarossa, so that was 16. So all this talk about all that's going on over there now is negated by the fact that China and Russia have a geostrategic economic alliance, and Iran is a silent partner. So none of these countries can be attacked. Iran cannot be attacked. North Korea cannot be attacked. Xi Jinping yesterday said, if the United States attacks North Korea, we will come in on North Korea's side. That means Russia will also be involved, because it's right on their border. If we invaded Iran or attacked Iran, that's right on their southern border. All of this is about this anaconda that Ann mentioned, they're constricting and crushing Russia, and that's been the strategy since 1945. Constrict, crush Russia. Russia is the military rival, China is the economic rival, and that's what Kissinger said. And so Iran cannot be attacked. North Korea cannot be attacked because there would be immediate hostile reaction from China and Russia. So it won't happen. And it's all related to a lecture given 114 years ago, or 13 years ago in England by a geographer named Halford McKendrick. And it's called the Heartland Theory. Russia is the military rival, and the Eastern Bloc countries, Iron Curtain countries, they're the gateway to the heartland. Ukraine is the door to the heartland, and that's why we did the coup in Ukraine. It's all about an attack on Russia, and they can't do it because it's against China too, and with Iran leading from behind. So I don't think any of those.
What's your question?
He mentioned he wasn't going to have a question, and they did go to Russia together, so that's one of the reasons I let Bill continue on, because he did have some good information. Let me just say this, and now I'm going to get you, Elsa, because I want to be fair. I hope you're right that it can't happen, but don't forget, many wars have started. That's so. I don't. Yeah, but I'm just saying, I hope you're right, but many wars have been started that shouldn't have happened, so we have to make sure we continue to do our work. So Elsa, and please, questions.
Question.
All right.
Okay. And you spoke about your trips to Germany recently, and you're going to be speaking at Ramstein also in September. I live in Germany, and none of you mentioned Europe. None of you mentioned the pushback starting to come from Europe. The fact that people do not want to vote to increase their military. It's a big issue in the coalition. So I want them to expand what you think about this. There was just recently also that the German parliament in a small majority said they don't want weapons with drones. So we have a potential there for the international peace movement that I do not see was mentioned, and I wondered if you could expand a bit on that.
Okay.
Bill? The mic? Be easier.
Okay, two quick questions. First of all, yesterday we voted to, in our resolutions, to ask Congress to remove Hezbollah from the terrorist list. And secondly, what has been the role, Phyllis, of Israel in the Syrian conflict?
That's 3 questions, so.
Shall I do this one? Okay, thank you, Elsa, for that. Yes, for both the No to NATO and G20 events in Europe this summer have been lots and lots of people from all over Europe that are coming in to challenge NATO and G20. So there is a very active movement, and we appreciate that very, very much. And as you mentioned, there's a lot of opportunity for us to have liaison with various groups in Europe. That said, we are up against a big force there, where the governments, with the exception of what you said, that the German parliament has now said no weaponized drones, but the rest of Europe, and the rest of the German policies are totally supportive of NATO and all of these military war games that are going on. If Trump keeps going, though, in the rhetoric, there are newspaper accounts that say that leaders in Europe are very concerned about what Trump is doing, the rhetoric, the high rhetoric of it, and that indeed it may be that if he keeps doing this sort of stuff, there may start to be some splits, that countries in Europe may not want to have his bombastic rhetoric on their shoulders, and we may see some splits coming up.
Thanks for this. These were all very good questions. Quickly, just to add one thing on the Elsa's question about the pushback in Europe, I think we also have to keep in mind there is a huge movement. There's also divides, as Anne just said, within the governments. There's also a huge right-wing backlash emerging in in Europe, very much as here. And it's particularly taking the shape of the anti-refugee movement, just like here. And I think it's a trickier one to fight against, because in Europe, to some degree, not quite like say in Lebanon, but in Europe there is a kind of refugee crisis that there isn't here. Here there's a racism crisis, not a refugee crisis. Europe has a refugee problem verging on crisis. Germany, I would say it is a kind of crisis. Greece, it's a kind of crisis, and right now Italy as well. But there's a huge pushback from that side, so that puts a lot of right-wing pressure on these governments, and they may be willing to cave in on some of the NATO issues in order to pacify their right wing around the refugee questions. I would disagree a little bit on the question of can Iran be attacked. I think it absolutely can be. I know you're saying no. I'm just saying why I disagree with you. Let me just say that. I think that I don't think it's likely, and I've been saying this for several years, I don't think a direct assault on Iran is likely. Not because Russia and China would absolutely come to its aid, because I think that's very tactical, particularly on the part of China, and I don't think that Russia is any longer the military threat that it was when Kissinger first made that statement. Russia is no longer a major military power, although it has nuclear weapons, which is an issue of its own, but it's, as we just heard, in terms of the spending, we spend 10 times what they do on conventional military. They have a lot of soldiers. They don't have the kind of military sophistication in missiles, drones, et cetera, that we do. So it's not the same level of threat that it once was during the Cold War. That doesn't mean that there's no connection in terms of Russia's role, but it does mean, I think, that it doesn't make it impossible. I do think what the danger is we come back to Yemen. The U.S. involvement in Yemen, it's not just supporting the Saudis, it's involved directly refueling the Saudi bombers with U.S. pilots flying U.S. Air Force planes to make their bombing more efficient. That's because this is seen widely in the region and in Tehran as an attack on Iran. It's wrong because, as we all know, Iran does not control the Houthi rebels in Yemen. It only hurts Yemenis. It doesn't hurt Iran directly, but it's a symbolic strike at Iran, and it's being billed as a strike for Saudi Arabia's challenge to Iran. On the question of Israel in Syria, I think that in general, the primary role that Israel has been playing in the Syrian war is to prevent weapons from getting to Hezbollah and prevent Hezbollah from being strengthened by new weapons, et cetera, in the context of the Syrian war that Israel believes could be used more directly against it. In the past, Israel has not been so interested in regime change in Syria because it had a very good relationship with Bashar al-Assad and it has with Hafez al-Assad. They've collaborated on the border to keep the occupied Golan Heights relatively pacified. There's a whole host of ways in which those regimes have collaborated, so regime change was not on the agenda. Israel did not want to see chaos on their border, nor did they want to see extremist Islamists of various sorts take power in Syria if the regime were to be overthrown. I think that may be shifting a bit now. I think they may be shifting more towards an anti-regime position, but they're not fully there. Where they are is very central in the anti-Iran coalition that I mentioned earlier with the collaboration between Jared Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman. One of the goals of that anti-Iran coalition, one of the Saudi goals, is to pull Israel into that regional anti-Iran coalition. Saudi Arabia is desperate to normalize relations with Israel. If it didn't have to worry about an uprising of its own population, it would do it in a minute. And one of the things they're trying to do is figure out quiet, underhanded ways of pulling Israel into that strategic coalition against Iran to strengthen it. Finally, on the question of hope and education, I think this is critical. The question of not just engendering hope, but giving people tools to fight back is really all of our responsibility. And there are things like the websites that we're hearing about. We need to be doing more teach-ins when people come back from these delegations. The report backs that they do are crucial, and we need to broaden them and do more of them. We need to get books out there. Please, please buy my books. Don't make me take them back home, please. But those books are done as primers. They're frequently asked questions, one on ISIS and the global war on terror, one on Palestine, et cetera. All of those kinds of pieces of information are crucial, but the thing is, we can't just use them for ourselves. We have to figure out ways to make them relevant to all the other movements that are rising around the country. That's what will really give people hope.
I saw 3 hands. I want to get Mike there, Ron, and Charles.
Should our focus be on the weapons manufacturers and weapons? I mean, the soldiers don't create weapons. We could eliminate weapons. We could stop wars, period.
Thank you.
He asked about the weapons manufacturers, how the soldiers don't create the weapons, the manufacturers do. So if we going after weapons manufacturers, you might be able to end war or at least stop what's going on.
I'll just quickly mention that in October, I think it's October 21st and 22nd in Washington, D.C., will be a conference on divestment from military corporations that are producing weapons. So you'll get a lot of information out of that conference in Washington, D.C., sponsored by Code Pink. There's a whole group of organizations. And also to put in a plug in September for the World Beyond War conference. It's going to be at American University. I believe it's September 21st and 22nd.
I was always entranced with unintended consequences. I think Trump is going to create lots of opportunity. I think his questionable leadership creates in the world a power vacuum that's going to be filled by others. They're going to stand up and say, well, if the U.S. isn't doing this anymore, maybe we have to. And I think it will surface new ways of approaching things.
Question.
And the question is, how do we stay ahead of that curve and put our options in there as the solution that makes sense?
Okay, thank you. Charles?
My question is for Will, and it's a real question.
Okay.
Matter of fact, that wasn't the question.
In regards to THAAD, it's my understanding that so-called missile defense systems are really enablers for first strikes, and I'd like to have you comment on that.
And let me get this one last question here, and then we'll wrap it up. And we have the drawing for the paddle, and then we'll go to the walk, the march.
Oh, okay. This is a quick question and could be with a quick answer. First of all, I have been very puzzled as somebody who taught a lot of media courses, why particularly the left media is getting it wrong on the long, long history of the war in Iraq. It's really 26 years. The war in Iraq did not begin in 2003. And yet I've heard Amy Goodman, I went through all of the publications I subscribed to, Mother Jones, The Progressive, even The Nation. They get it wrong. They're talking about the start of the war in Iraq as 2003 and claiming falsely that the war in Afghanistan is our longest war. Every week we hear this, so what about it?
Totally agree with you. Totally. Okay.
Oh, yeah, I'll start. Sure.
Oh.
Reaching.
Thank you. Yeah, you know, I did forget to mention that in my talk about THAAD being an enabler, as you said, of first strike policy, which is, that is what it is, despite it not being proven to work, right? So everyone grew up with mutually assured destruction. You shoot me, I'll shoot back, we're both gone. Well, according to the Pentagon, they believe they can take down your missile so we can actually use a first strike. And that's the policy, that's what's going on, especially towards North Korea, which is super, super dangerous, and it's destabilizing the region. But THAAD, like I said, is a system. It not only does it have the interceptor missile that is designed to take down the incoming threat missile, but it has a radar that it has the potential to conduct surveillance over large portions of China and even parts of Russia. And really, there's been more kickback from Russia and China than there has from North Korea, because I think North Korea knows it's not going to work. And like I said, it's a high-altitude defense system. North Korea doesn't need a high-altitude defense system to shoot missiles in South Korea. But the radar is incredibly destabilizing. And when you're threatening the national security of China, Russia, North Korea with a nuclear first strike type of policy, there's no room for talks for disarmament to vote against nuclear weapons, right? You're just completely getting rid of that talk, and that's why it's destabilizing, and it's only going to proliferate the idea of building more nuclear weapons. And again, you know, who's the only country in the world to actually use nuclear weapons on a population? Our country.
You know, on the question of the history of the Iraq War, I think that there's a lot of different ways to read that history. I think that if, for the people living in Iraq or Afghanistan, and by your figuring, Afghanistan is a far longer war than Iraq because it began in 1978. The US attacks on Afghanistan and haven't stopped since, so Afghanistan is indeed our longest war. But I think there is an important recognition that while for the people living under our war policies, the wars don't necessarily change in the sense of ending and then becoming new wars. What they do, though, is dramatically change the nature of the war. So there was a US war against Iraq in 1990-91 that was over in 1991 after 3 weeks. And then there was a war of sanctions for 12 years. And the sanctions killed a huge number of people, including 500,000 children, according to Madeleine Albright, despite the fact that LSE is now claiming that new information indicates that that figure is exaggerated, but whatever. Hundreds of thousands of people were killed by sanctions. There was then the so-called global war on terror. That does have its own political reality in terms of when it started, why it started, how movements were built against it. That becomes very, very important. So I think it's right to identify different phases. Historians, it's right, should recognize the continuity of war policies, and most historians, particularly all left historians, do. But in talking about the war that's being waged right now is not the war of sanctions of the 1990s in Iraq. It's a different war. It's a different war that began with shock and awe in March of 2003. This war in Afghanistan began not in 1978, when the CIA was involved in supporting what became the Taliban and in arming Osama bin Laden and all of that. This is a different war that began on October 7th of 2001. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think you're talking about news outlets that are dealing with news. The news is about today's war in Afghanistan that began in 2001, not in 1978. In Iraq, this war began in 2003, not in 1990. So I think there's a value in it. History isn't the same as news, and the key thing is, how are we mobilizing against it? That's where we need hope to remember, and I'll end with one last point, because I know this is our roundup. When we talk about the mobilization of February 15th, 2003, that I'm betting everybody in this room was part of, some of you may be in a baby basket, but nonetheless, everybody here was part of that. We sometimes get into the shorthand of saying that was a mobilization that failed. That's wrong. It didn't fail. It did not succeed at the ultimate goal, which was to prevent the war in Iraq, but it did enormous other things, including preventing a war against Iran that was about to break out in 2007 because of fear of that happening again. It taught us how to build a global movement that had never happened before. And crucially, in Egypt, it set the stage for the Arab Spring and the overthrow of Mubarak. That was huge. So never say that that protest failed. Thank you.
And then to Ron's question, what do we do? How do we capitalize on mistakes that are happening? Well, we've got the tools at our hands. We've got the tools right now. It's just using them. If you look at what our organization, Veterans for Peace, has, if you look at our resolutions, if you look at our campaigns, I don't think there's a group in the country that has as wide range of campaigns that we have, with extensive documentation and resources for every single one of those. So our challenge is, how do we use it? How do we mobilize the people locally? How do we, when we come back from this conference, do we have a town hall sponsored by Veterans for Peace where we start talking about whatever issue it is you think is going to resonate most in your community right now, whether it's the campaign against Islamophobia, considering what just happened in Charlottesville, or whether it's the Korean peace campaign for the North Korea things. We already have the resources, and it's up to us to go not only to our community, but our community representatives, that we have to make a concerted effort to go to our congressional delegations, and you may just have to get a clothespin to your nose, but we've got to keep after even these jerks that we know will never listen to us, but we've got to keep going, because there may be a staffer on their staff that may start listening, considering these terrible, terrible times. And then, even though Veterans for Peace is a non-political organization, we as individuals must take the responsibility that in our local communities that we help find candidates that we can trust, that reflect our values, and we must help them get elected, because if we don't, we're up shit creek again. We've only got a year and a half before the next elections. And even though it is not an issue for Veterans for Peace as such, and we as individuals must take responsibility. And with that, on behalf of all of us at Vets for Peace, will you all please join us in thanking all the organizers in Chicago and a part of our national staff for a great conference.